Today, we bring you a tale of transformation, redemption, and the power of second chances. James Whitman, a wealthy but arrogant businessman, thought he had everything figured out until a humbling encounter with Angela Carter and the children of Sunshine Haven Orphanage turned his world upside down. What begins as a lesson in humility soon becomes a journey of profound self-discovery, empathy, and the true meaning of success. Subscribe to Life Stories to join us as we dive into this heartwarming story of growth and compassion. Let's begin today's journey. James Whitman leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes glinting with satisfaction as the soft glow of his computer screen illuminated his face. He had just sealed another multi-million-dollar deal, one that would further solidify his place at the top of the business world. Another victory, he muttered to himself, the corner of his mouth curling into a smirk. His office, perched on the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Chicago, felt like a fortress, a kingdom he had built with his own hands, or so he liked to believe. A knock on the door interrupted his moment of triumph. "Come in," James called sharply, his tone impatient. His assistant, Claire, stepped in hesitantly, a folder clutched to her chest. "Mr. Whitman," she began softly, "Robert Maxwell is here to see you." James waved dismissively. "Fine. Send him in." Claire nodded and retreated. And moments later, Robert Maxwell entered the room. Robert, an old acquaintance and business associate, always seemed a bit too cautious for James's taste. But he had his uses. "What is it?" "Robert, I'm a busy man," James said curtly, barely glancing up. Robert adjusted his tie nervously. "I just wanted to remind you about the dinner tomorrow evening at Marlowe's," he said. "It's that new 5-star restaurant downtown." At this, James looked up. His interest peaked. "Ah, yes. Who's attending?" "Well," Robert said, "there's talk that Angela Carter might be there." James raised an eyebrow. The name was vaguely familiar. "And why should I care about Angela Carter?" Robert hesitated. "She's the CEO of Carter Solutions. Their influence in the tech industry is substantial." James smirked. "Substantial? That's putting it mildly. If she's there, I'll make sure she knows who runs this city." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just her. There will also be several other potential partners, people who could be important for your expansion plans." James stood, straightening his designer suit. "Perfect. Tomorrow night. They'll all see why the name James Whitman is synonymous with success." He strode to the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out over the sparkling cityscape below. "This is my world, Robert. And tomorrow night, I'll remind everyone why." The next evening, Marlowe's was alive with soft jazz music and the clink of crystal glasses. The restaurant, with its understated elegance and a menu curated by a world-renowned chef, was a haven for the city's elite. James stepped out of his impeccably detailed car, his tailored suit gleaming under the streetlights. Heads turned as he entered, his presence commanding attention. The maître d' greeted him warmly and led him to his table. But as James scanned the room, his sharp gaze fell upon a figure seated in a quiet corner. Angela Carter. She was alone, dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, her demeanor calm and composed. She didn't have the ostentatious jewelry or loud displays of wealth James associated with power. To him, she looked out of place. Unbelievable. James muttered under his breath, irritation bubbling up inside him. He couldn't fathom how someone like her could command the kind of respect she did. She didn't fit the image of success he had built in his mind, polished, flashy, powerful. No, she seemed too understated, too ordinary. Unable to contain himself, James leaned over to Robert, who was seated nearby. "Can you believe they let anyone in here these days?" he said, loud enough for a few nearby patrons to overhear. "Look at her. Does she even know what fork to use?" Robert stiffened, his discomfort evident. But James didn't stop. Emboldened by the attention of a few curious diners, He continued. I bet she's here on some charity handout. No way someone like her can afford this place. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Angela, though seated several tables away, had clearly heard him. She glanced up, her eyes briefly meeting James's before returning to her glass of water. Her expression didn't change, no anger, no embarrassment, just a quiet dignity that unsettled James more than he cared to admit. But his irritation only grew. How dare she act as though his words didn't matter? James stood abruptly, drawing even more attention. Hey, you, he called out, pointing toward Angela. This isn't some soup kitchen. You know, places like this are for people who've earned their success. The room fell silent. Forks froze mid-air, and diners exchanged uneasy glances. Angela remained seated, her composure unshaken. She didn't react to James's outburst, instead calmly taking a sip of her water. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until a new voice cut through it. Excuse me, said Robert Maxwell, rising from his seat. James, I think it's time you sat down. James turned, startled. Robert's expression was one of disappointment, his calm tone carrying an authority that James hadn't anticipated. And then Robert added, his voice firm. You might want to rethink how you treat people, James. Especially when you don't know who they are. For a moment, James was frozen, his mind racing. He looked back at Angela, who had resumed her quiet meal, and then at the room full of onlookers, all of whom seemed to be silently judging him. And for the first time in his career, James Whitman felt the sting of doubt. The oppressive silence in Marlowe's lingered as James Whitman sank back into his chair. His cheeks flushed crimson, but he masked it with a tight smile, brushing off Robert Maxwell's remark with a dismissive wave. Relax, Robert, James muttered, reaching for his wine glass. It was just a joke. But deep down, the weight of the moment clung to him like an unwelcome guest. The eyes of the other diners still bore into his back, their disapproval palpable. He glanced again at Angela Carter, expecting her to show some reaction, some acknowledgement of his verbal assault. But instead, she remained calm, serene, as though his words hadn't even scratched the surface of her self-assured demeanor. It irritated him even more. Angela sat with a quiet elegance that James couldn't ignore, though she appeared unassuming in her simple dress. There was something about her presence that commanded respect, a contrast to the loud, ostentatious bravado James had spent his career cultivating. It unsettled him. Robert, sensing the tension, cleared his throat and leaned closer. James, he whispered urgently, I don't think you understand who Angela Carter is. Of course, I do, James snapped, his irritation breaking through his thin veneer of composure. She's just another CEO trying to climb the ladder. Why? Am I supposed to be impressed? Robert shook his head, exhaling slowly. Angela isn't just another CEO. She's the head of Carter Solutions, one of the most respected companies in the tech industry. And she's one of the most influential figures in this city. The deal you're hoping to close tonight? The expansion plans you've been working on? None of it will happen without her support. James froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He turned back toward Angela, a sinking realization beginning to take shape in his mind. Could it be true? The woman he had just humiliated in front of a room full of Chicago's elite was not only a key player in his industry but also someone who held immense power over his future prospects. Robert wasn't done. And another thing, he added, his voice low but firm. Angela is known for her philanthropy. She's helped countless people in this city, funding scholarships, building community centers, supporting underprivileged families. She doesn't need to flaunt her wealth or power because her actions speak louder than words. James swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He glanced toward Angela again, this time with different eyes. She wasn't sitting there to seek approval or to prove her worth. She didn't need to. Her very presence was a statement. a quiet but undeniable reminder of what true power looked like. For the first time in years, James felt small. The confidence he usually wore like armor now felt like an ill-fitting disguise. He could feel the stares of the other diners, the judgment in their eyes, and the growing pit of regret forming in his stomach. Before he could fully process the situation, Robert stood up from the table. "Excuse me for a moment," he said. His tone clipped. James watched as Robert walked over to Angela's table, stopping beside her and exchanging a few quiet words. Angela looked up, meeting Robert's gaze with a nod. Then, much to James's horror, both of them turned their eyes toward him. Angela rose gracefully from her chair, following Robert as he approached James's table. Her steps were calm and deliberate, and James suddenly felt as though the entire room had shrunk, with all its attention now focused on him. "James," Robert said, his voice steady but firm, "I believe there's someone you should meet." Angela extended her hand, her expression composed but her eyes piercing. "James Whitman," she said, her tone measured. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." James stared at her hand, his own trembling slightly as he reached out to shake it. "Miss Carter," he stammered, his voice barely audible. I didn't realize." Angela cut him off with a polite but firm smile. "That much was clear," she said. There was no malice in her tone, but her words carried an unmistakable weight. "I've always believed that a person's character is revealed in how they treat others, especially when they think no one is watching." James felt the floor beneath him give way. The weight of her words pressed on his chest, and for a brief moment, he couldn't breathe. He had prided himself on being sharp, strategic, always in control, but now, stripped of his bravado, he felt exposed, vulnerable. He had let his arrogance and prejudice blind him, and the consequences were unfolding before his very eyes. Angela gave him one final look, a mixture of disappointment and compassion, before turning to Robert. "I believe we have other matters to discuss," she said. "Shall we?" Robert nodded and followed her toward another table, leaving James sitting alone in stunned silence. The murmurs of the other diners began to fill the room once more, but James barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of regret and self-recrimination. He had come to this dinner expecting to showcase his dominance, to prove that he belonged among the elite. Instead, he had been brought to his knees by a woman who embodied everything he had dismissed: grace, humility, and true strength. As he sat there, staring at his untouched plate, James realized that this evening would haunt him for a long time. But what he didn't yet know was that it would also become the catalyst for the most profound transformation of his life. James Whitman spent the rest of that evening in a fog of disbelief and shame. When he returned to his penthouse apartment, he paced the glossy wooden floors, replaying the dinner over and over in his mind. Angela Carter's words echoed relentlessly: "A person's character is revealed in how they treat others, especially when they think no one is watching." The next morning, a call from Robert Maxwell jolted James from his sleepless haze. The voice on the other end of the line was firm. "James, if you want any chance of salvaging your reputation and your expansion plans, you need to fix this. You embarrassed yourself and, frankly, me last night. But Angela is a forgiving person. There may be a way to make amends." James's heart sank as Robert continued. "Angela runs an orphanage downtown, a place she's deeply connected to. She suggested you volunteer there. It's not just about apologizing. She wants you to understand the impact of your actions. If you're serious about change, this is your chance." An orphanage? The very thought unsettled James. He was used to boardrooms and high-rise meetings, not struggling neighborhoods and children in need. But the memory of Angela's steady, piercing gaze haunted him. He knew he had no choice. Reluctantly, he agreed. The following afternoon, James arrived at the Sunshine Haven Orphanage, a modest brick building nestled in a worn but vibrant part of Chicago. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass mixed with the metallic tang of the nearby train tracks. James hesitated at the entrance, adjusting his tailored jacket, a choice that now seemed painfully out of place. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The head caretaker, Mrs. Baker, greeted him warmly. She was a cheerful woman in her 50s with a face lined by both laughter and worry. "Mr. Whitman, we're so glad you're here," she said, extending her hand. Her kindness was genuine, but James noticed the subtle flicker of skepticism in her eyes. He wasn't sure if it was because of his reputation or his visibly awkward demeanor. "I'm happy to help," James muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he felt like a fish out of water, surrounded by peeling paint, tiny chairs, and walls covered in crayon drawings. Mrs. Baker led him to the playroom, where a group of children ranging from toddlers to teenagers were scattered around. Their laughter filled the room. But as James entered, a few pairs of curious eyes turned toward him. He froze, unsure of how to engage with these young faces. "Everyone," Mrs. Baker announced with a clap of her hands. "This is Mr. Whitman. He'll be volunteering with us for a while. Be kind and show him around." A little girl with pigtails immediately ran up to him, her gap-toothed smile beaming. "Do you want to play blocks with me?" she asked, tugging at his sleeve. James hesitated, feeling a flush of discomfort. Sure," he said, lowering himself awkwardly to the floor. As he fumbled with the blocks, a boy sitting across the room caught his eye. He was about 8 or 9, with deep brown eyes that seemed older than his years. His face bore a guarded expression, his shoulders hunched as though ready to defend himself from an unseen threat. James later learned his name was Marcus. "Who's that?" James asked Mrs. Baker, nodding toward the boy. "That's Marcus," she replied quietly. "He's been through a lot. Trust doesn't come easily to him. Don't take it personally if he keeps his distance." James nodded but couldn't help feeling drawn to Marcus. Something about the boy reminded him of himself, a quiet but simmering need to prove he didn't need anyone. Over the next few days, James returned to the orphanage. But each visit was a struggle. He wasn't used to the chaos, the noise, or the raw emotions of children who had seen far too much of life's hardships. Yet, he found himself coming back, compelled by something he couldn't quite name. He spent hours stacking blocks with the younger kids, helping with homework, and even enduring the humiliation of being it during a game of tag. But Marcus remained aloof, watching James from a distance with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and curiosity. One day, James approached Marcus as the boy sat alone by the window, sketching in a worn notebook. "Hey," James said, sitting beside him. "What are you drawing?" Marcus shrugged without looking up. "Stuff." James chuckled awkwardly. "Mind if I see?" The boy hesitated before flipping the notebook closed. "Why do you care?" The question caught James off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. "I guess," James said slowly, "I just want to know you better." Marcus turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "People like you don't care about people like me," he said flatly. The words hit James like a punch to the chest. He wanted to argue, to insist it wasn't true. But deep down, he knew Marcus was right. For most of his life, he hadn't cared. "Not really. I'm sorry," James said softly. "You're right. I haven't cared. But I'm trying to change. And if you'll let me, I'd like to start here with you." Marcus didn't respond. But for the first time, his expression softened just slightly. James took that as a small victory. As the sun began to set that evening, James left the orphanage feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stock prices or expansion plans. He was thinking about Marcus. And for the first time, James wondered if his definition of success had been wrong all along. James Whitman's visits to the orphanage became a steady rhythm in his otherwise chaotic life. At first, he told himself it was about salvaging his reputation, about doing what Angela Carter and Robert Maxwell expected of him. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. The children at Sunshine Haven had a way of breaking through the walls he'd spent years building, walls fortified by arrogance, ambition, and a relentless need to stay ahead. Every morning when James walked into his sleek, modern office, the stark contrast between his corporate world and the orphanage weighed on him. His assistant, Claire, would hand him his daily schedule, her polite smile masking the weariness he often overlooked. He began noticing things he hadn't before, the exhaustion in her eyes, the hesitance in her voice when she spoke to him. He thought back to how Marcus had looked at him on that first day at the orphanage, his gaze filled with suspicion and hurt. The realization struck James like a lightning bolt. Claire probably saw him the same way. One evening, after a long day at work, James sat in his spacious penthouse staring out over the glittering Chicago skyline. The view that once filled him with pride now left him feeling hollow. He thought about Marcus and the way the boy had accused him. People like you don't care about people like me. And it wasn't just Marcus. James thought of all the people he had dismissed over the years, colleagues, assistants, strangers, all judged as unworthy of his time or respect. The next day at the orphanage, James found himself sitting on the floor in the playroom, surrounded by a group of children. One of the younger boys, Tommy, had crawled into his lap, holding a tattered book about dinosaurs. "Can you read this to me?" Tommy asked, his wide eyes hopeful. James hesitated. He couldn't remember the last time he'd read a children's book. But something about the boy's trust tugged at him. "Sure," he said, his voice softer than usual, as he read aloud, stumbling over the names of prehistoric creatures. The children giggled and corrected him. For the first time in years, James laughed, not the forced, performative laugh he used in boardrooms, but a genuine, unguarded laugh. Across the room, Marcus watched silently, his notebook perched on his knees. James caught his eye and gave him a small smile. But Marcus quickly looked away. Still, James noticed the boy's guarded demeanor seemed to be thawing. Little by little. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Baker found James in the kitchen, helping a few older kids prepare sandwiches for lunch. She handed him a glass of lemonade and leaned against the counter. "You're different from when you first came here," she said, her tone thoughtful. James paused, unsure how to respond. "I guess I've had a lot to think about," he admitted. Mrs. Baker nodded. "These kids have a way of teaching us things we didn't know we needed to learn. Marcus, especially. He's a tough nut to crack. But once he trusts you, he'll give you everything." James thought about that as he left the orphanage that day. Marcus's story weighed heavily on him. The boy had been through foster homes where he was treated like a burden, schools where he was judged before he ever spoke, and neighborhoods where he was seen as a statistic rather than a person. And yet, despite it all, Marcus carried himself with a quiet resilience that James couldn't help but admire. That evening, James opened his laptop and began typing an email to Angela Carter. He wanted to thank her for pushing him to volunteer at the orphanage. But as he stared at the blank screen, he realized he wasn't ready to put his thoughts into words. Instead, he closed the laptop and grabbed a notepad. 4 hours. He wrote down everything he'd been feeling, the shame, the regret, the unexpected joy of connecting with the children. For the first time in years, James wasn't thinking about his next deal or his public image. He was thinking about the kind of person he wanted to be. The next morning, James arrived at the office earlier than usual. Claire looked up in surprise as he placed a steaming cup of coffee on her desk. "Good morning," he said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. "Thank you for everything you do, Claire. I don't say it enough." Claire blinked, startled, but then gave him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman." As James walked into his office, he felt lighter. The simple act of showing gratitude felt like another small step forward. At the orphanage that afternoon, James approached Marcus, who was sketching by the window again. "Hey," James said, sitting beside him. "What are you drawing today?" Marcus hesitated, then held up the notebook. It was a picture of two figures, a tall man and a small boy, standing under a tree. The lines were wobbly, but the intent was clear. "That's us," Marcus said quietly. James felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached out and ruffled Marcus's hair gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, James realized something profound. Marcus wasn't just a child in need of guidance. He was a mirror, reflecting back all the lessons James had avoided learning for years. And for the first time in his life, James wasn't afraid to face them. James Whitman had started his journey at the orphanage feeling like an outsider, uncertain and awkward. Now, weeks later, he felt a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in years. The children had become his teachers, each of them showing him the value of resilience, kindness, and understanding in ways no corporate mentor or business deal ever could. But he knew his journey wasn't complete. It was time to face Angela Carter again and attempt to make things right. On a crisp autumn afternoon, James stood outside the glass doors of Angela's office building, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. Yet now, faced with the reality of it, his confidence wavered. Adjusting his tie, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. Angela's assistant greeted him with a polite smile. "Mr. Whitman, Ms. Carter is expecting you. Please, follow me." James nodded, following her to Angela's expansive office. The room was understated yet elegant, much like Angela herself. She sat behind a sleek desk, her expression calm but unreadable. The sight of her immediately brought back the memory of that fateful evening at Marlowe's. James felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. "Ms. Carter," James began, his voice steady but soft. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Angela gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Have a seat, Mr. Whitman." James sat, his hands resting on his lap, fingers nervously twisting his wedding band. He took another deep breath and began. "I owe you an apology, not just for what I said that night, but for how I've lived my life. I realize now how blind I've been, how often I've judged people unfairly. Volunteering at the orphanage, it's been humbling, to say the least." Angela's gaze softened slightly, though she said nothing, allowing James to continue. "Those kids," he said, his voice growing more emotional, "they've shown me the strength it takes to endure things I can't even begin to imagine. Marcus, in particular, he's made me see how much damage people like me can cause when we judge others without understanding their stories." Angela leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "And what have you learned from that, James?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. James hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've learned that success isn't about what you can take or what you can build for yourself. It's about the impact you have on others. For so long, I thought my accomplishments made me superior. But now I see that they mean nothing if I can't use them to help those who need it most." Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And do you think this realization will last? Or is it just guilt driving you right now?" The question hit James hard, but he appreciated her directness. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again," he admitted. "But I can promise that I'm committed to changing, to being the kind of person who sees people for who they are, not what they appear to be." Angela studied him for a long moment, her sharp gaze seeming to pierce straight through him. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, James. And I can see that you're trying. But real change takes time and consistency." "I know," James replied earnestly, "and I'm willing to put in the work." Angela leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Good. Because the partnership we were discussing is back on the table under one condition." James straightened in his seat, his heart skipping a beat. "Anything," he said quickly. "This partnership," Angela said, her tone firm, "must be based on shared values, empathy, integrity." and a commitment to making a positive impact on the community. If you're willing to commit to that, then I believe we can do great things together. James nodded, his voice filled with sincerity. I am. I will. Thank you, Ms. Carter. Angela rose from her seat, extending her hand. Then let's move forward, James. As they shook hands, James felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a second chance. A rare opportunity to rebuild not only his professional relationships but also his own sense of self. Over the next few weeks, the partnership between James and Angela flourished. Their collaboration brought together the best of both their companies, and their shared commitment to ethical business practices set a new standard in their industry. Angela guided James toward initiatives that focused on social responsibility, from funding scholarships for underprivileged youth to creating job opportunities in struggling communities. James threw himself into these projects with a passion he hadn't felt in years. He visited the orphanage regularly, spending time with Marcus and the other children. He listened to their stories, learned their dreams, and worked to create opportunities that could help them achieve those dreams. One day, as James sat with Marcus in the orphanage's playroom, the boy handed him a drawing. It was a simple picture of the two of them standing side by side, with the words "thank you" written in shaky letters at the top. James stared at it, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you for being my friend," Marcus said quietly. James looked at the boy, his eyes misty. "No, Marcus," he replied. "Thank you for everything." As James drove home that evening, the city lights reflecting in his car's windows, he realized that his life had taken a turn he never could have predicted. Success, he now understood, wasn't about towering above others, it was about standing with them. And for the first time, James felt like he was truly succeeding. James Whitman stood in the middle of the Sunshine Haven courtyard, surrounded by laughter and music. It was the annual charity event, and the orphanage was alive with energy. Colorful balloons bobbed in the breeze. Children darted around tables covered with games and snacks, and the warm golden light of the setting sun cast a glow over the festivities. For the first time in years, James felt something he hadn't known he was missing: joy. Not from wealth or status, but from being part of something meaningful. Marcus tugged on his sleeve, pulling James's attention away from the decorations. "Come on, Mr. Whitman. We need you for the three-legged race," the boy exclaimed. His face lit up with excitement. James laughed, shaking his head. "Marcus, I think I'm a little too old for that." "Nah," Marcus said with a mischievous grin. "You're just scared you'll lose." James couldn't help but smile. "All right. You're on." As they lined up for the race, James noticed Angela Carter standing nearby with Robert Maxwell. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place, pride mixed with quiet amusement. The whistle blew, and James, tied to Marcus, stumbled forward, struggling to keep pace with the boy's youthful energy. They didn't win, but the uproarious laughter and high fives that followed made him feel like a champion anyway. Later that evening, as the event began to wind down, Angela approached James. She held a cup of coffee in one hand and gestured toward a quiet corner with the other. "Care for a chat?" she asked. James nodded, following her to a small bench under a string of twinkling lights. The children's laughter echoed faintly in the background, mingling with the distant hum of the city. Angela took a sip of her coffee, then turned to him. "You've come a long way, James," she said, her tone warm but serious. "When I first saw you at Marlowe's, I wasn't sure you'd even show up here, let alone stick around." James chuckled softly, looking down at his hands. "Honestly, I wasn't sure either. I didn't think this was the kind of place I belonged." He glanced toward Marcus, who was helping a younger child pack up art supplies. "But now, I can't imagine not being part of this." Angela studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. "What's changed?" she asked simply. James exhaled slowly. collecting his thoughts. I used to think success was all about power, control, and showing the world that I'd made it. I thought that's what made me worthy, what gave me value. He paused, his voice softening. But these kids, this place, they've shown me that success isn't about being above others. It's about lifting people up. About leaving the world a little better than you found it. Angela nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. And do you feel like you're doing that now? James met her gaze, his expression earnest. I'm trying. And for the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. Angela reached over, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's all anyone can ask. But remember, change isn't a one-time decision, it's a choice you have to make every day. I know, James replied. And I'm ready for that. The two of them sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the last of the guests said their goodbyes. Marcus ran up to James, clutching a small, hand-drawn card. This is for you, he said, his voice shy but steady. James opened it carefully. Inside was a simple drawing of a tree with two figures beneath it. Written in bold, uneven letters were the words, "You're part of our family now." James felt his throat tighten, and he pulled Marcus into a hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." As the courtyard emptied and the evening turned to night, James lingered for a moment, looking around at the quiet, twinkling space. Angela joined him one last time, her expression thoughtful. "James," she said, "you've proven something tonight, not just to me, but to yourself. Don't lose sight of that." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty playground. "I won't. And thank you for giving me a chance to prove I could change." Angela smiled, a genuine, warm expression that softened her sharp features. "We all deserve second chances, James. It's what we do with them that matters." As James drove home that night, he thought about everything he'd learned over the past few months. The deals he used to obsess over, the power plays he once prided himself on, all seemed trivial compared to the impact he now felt in helping others. Marcus's words echoed in his mind, "You're part of our family now." For the first time in years, James Whitman felt at peace. He wasn't just building a business anymore, he was building a legacy. A legacy of empathy, integrity, and meaningful change. And as he pulled into his driveway, James smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning of his new purpose. As James Whitman stood at the doorway of the Sunshine Haven Orphanage, waving goodbye to the children, he felt a warmth he had never known before. The laughter of the kids echoed in his mind, reminding him of how much his life had changed. Success no longer meant climbing higher than others but walking alongside them, lifting them up when they needed it most. Turning to Marcus, who smiled shyly while holding his latest drawing, James realized that he had found a purpose greater than wealth or power. He had become someone he could finally be proud of. This journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about transformation. About learning to see the world through the eyes of compassion and empathy. And as James walked away, he knew this was only the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales like this one.